We're going to take a few minutes here. We're going to talk about sustainability. I'm really excited to have some of my friends here on stage. And many of you may ask, what's Land O'Lakes got to do with sustainability? So over the last 8 years, Land O'Lakes has really been a pioneer in the development and distribution of ag technology. We're actually the largest ag technology distributor in the US today. And through our network of local cooperative and ag retailers, we touch over 100 million acres in the United States and over 300,000 growers. We have this belief that the only sustainable farmer is a profitable farmer. And we believe this so much that our company about 6 months ago created a whole new division that's focused on sustainability. It's very rare as we look at consumer trends that you see such an alignment with the growing community and a consumer trend like sustainability. All the growers that we talk to out in the field, not a single one of them wants their nitrogen investment to end up anywhere except in their crop. Not a single grower wants to spend an extra dime on a crop protection product that doesn't help them. So when you have that kind of alignment, we believe this to be a very huge opportunity for our industry. So only by allowing farmers, to optimize those yields and profits in the most sustainable way do we believe we can really feed these 9 billion people. So I have here with me Megan Nunes, the founder and chief executive officer of Vinsight, and Steve, chief executive officer of Agronomic. And I'm going to ask them a couple questions, but first I'm going to turn it over to you, Megan. So can you tell me a little bit about your company and how these sustainability practices affect, the industries you serve?
Yeah, so at Vinsight, we are a data company in the agricultural space, and we offer crop forecasting using data techniques from satellite imagery, climate weather data, geographical information, and historical yields. And so our main objective is to get to a place of understanding crop production in real time in order to figure out how we can address the potential inputs that will either increase yield or reach the dedicated target that X grower is wanting to see. So for us and from our perspective, it's all about measuring and understanding what are we producing with the current methodology and how do we potentially improve to meet our marks.
So tell me a little bit more about the metrics you use. Are there any key metrics that are really resonating with both, your consumers as well as the suppliers?
Yeah, so for us, our metrics come from the data sets that we utilize. And climate and weather tend to be our largest one. That tends to affect the crops most. And so what we do is we utilize weather in real time to understand how that is affecting and being potentially changed with the inputs that the grower is doing through other management practices within both the grape and almond industry.
Great, that's great. Steve, I want to turn it over to you. You were one of the first startups to recognize that you had to start measuring sustainability at really a field-by-field level. So tell us a little bit more about Agronomic and really, what led you down the path to commercialize AdaptN?
Sure, yeah. So the company is Agronomic Technology Corp, and we provide advanced soil, crop, field management modeling that is applied at a field level or a subfield level. And we're primarily known for one of our products in the nitrogen management space, which is called AdaptN. And AdaptN was built originally by Cornell, commercialized by us 12 years after the development started in 2013. And what really got my partners and I, we worked together before in another company, but what was exciting to us was the inefficiency that we saw in the nitrogen space. So the platform covers all of these different domains, but we saw a $130 billion market, and we heard the statistic about nitrogen inefficiency. 40% of it is lost. That's a massive inefficiency. And the more we dug into it at the regulatory level, at the agronomy level, at the grower level, the more opportunity there seemed to be to apply technology and agronomic modeling to go and inform growers about how to make better decisions about it.
That's great. Now, when we talk about nitrogen, optimization, did you see an economic impact as well on those farms?
Yeah, it's a good question.
Impact?
So The work that Cornell did starting in 2002 was actually deployed in market in 2008 and then calibrated, and there were replicated strip trials that started in 2011. And what was compelling about it was that it actually did break the trade-off between financial and environmental performance to the level of about $30 an acre. It's for row crop growers, primarily corn. So $30 an acre through either yield improvement by anticipating nitrogen stress events, sometimes through nitrogen efficiency, you're deploying it over different parcels of land, temporally and spatially. And then what was more compelling, I think, was that economic advantage, but also the reduction in nitrogen loss. So about a 38% reduction in greenhouse gas emission. Nitrous oxide is a very potent greenhouse gas, as you know. And then also nitrogen that was lost into the hydrology. So you read about the dead zones and hypoxic conditions. A lot of that comes through the application of nitrogen fertilizer and the loss. So that's why we thought this was a trade-off breaking technology.
That's great. That's great. I want to change our attention here to water for a second. Land O'Lakes presented at South by Southwest this past event season with National Geographic. And even I was amazed as I watched the clips on how much water is used to make even a cup of coffee or to create a beer. And, we believe that water is probably going to be the first resource that's truly constrained around the globe. We see stresses in different areas, and not to mention the drought that we just exhibited here in California. So, Megan, how have your customers reacted to that? And both during the drought and then after the drought, have you seen behavioral changes or changes in the way they look at water?
Yeah, so for us, we focus on high value crops, which is an area that has transitioned into drip system irrigation for several years now. And when we were during drought and in the peak of all of that a few years ago, we had a couple customers whose fields just were either totally dormant and they did as little as they could to kind of keep them alive. And so now obviously their behavioral change has been, we have our water allocation and we're now back in action. As far as on the behavioral change related to types of irrigation systems, we have seen some folks that, believe it or not, we're still flood irrigating, have changed that over into drip or implemented sprinklers within their orchards in order to help be a little bit more conservative with their water allocations.
That's good. Now, do you think they took the opportunity, though, to invest for the next drought? Or, how do you see that playing out?
We've had a couple that either went into partnership with a couple other larger farm operators in the area that either put in new well systems or different access to water points for themselves. But outside of that, that's really as much as what we've seen and had opportunity to have access to.
Good. Steve, how about in the Midwest? I think we went through a drought in 07, 08 time period, and it drove commodity prices up. Now, we don't have access to pivots and as much land mass as we do out here on the West Coast, but tell me a little bit on what you're seeing in Midwest crops.
Well, there's a real divide, obviously, between rain-fed and irrigated corn. On the rain-fed side, where we do a lot of work, the types of conversations are primarily about regenerative agriculture around increasing the field, the water holding capacity of the soil, applications of manure and compost, conservation tillage, and the preparation for adverse weather events. And a lot of that is outside of the data space. We work with a number of companies that are doing things on the genetic engineering side. So it's being addressed holistically. It's a cocktail. I'll be honest, what's been occupying my thoughts are on the other side, on the irrigated side. And here, I'll be careful because there are real experts in this audience on irrigation. But what I am concerned about from a sustainability perspective is, I was in a conversation with someone who was talking about our fresh water supply, and they said, thank you. I can't even hear myself. So I was talking to someone about the fresh water supply, and they said, well, you know that 2.5% of all global water is fresh water. And I said, yeah, well, I know that. And he said, well, most of that is frozen, right? It's glacial and ice cap, knock on wood, and some of it is groundwater. So it's about 1 1.5% of that is surface available water. And then most of that is permafrost. And I thought, okay, this is, we're dealing with the wafer thin. Every time my daughter takes a shower, I could feel the aquifers going down, and so, I worry about that because if you look at, there's so many great innovations in precision irrigation that it should be, that should be receiving the amount of attention that they're getting. But if you look at like the High Plains aquifer and how it's being depleted, right, the amount of withdrawal relative to the recharge of it, there's a frightening imbalance there. And so if you're really talking about sustainability and irrigation, I think you need to look, we need to look at that type of, decade level impact that even irrigation is having. So, it's concerning.
Yeah. Even on a global scale, I think Americans are pretty, and Canadians for that matter, are pretty content. We have such access to fresh water with the Great Lakes region and all the aquifers in the US, and we don't feel a lot of those stresses these other countries have, like Australia or Israel, which were talked about earlier. I want to change the perspective a little bit to the consumer side of sustainability. Megan, the big question out there, and we've seen a market develop for organics and other high-value foods, but there's a lot of producers asking, will consumers pay more for sustainable food? Because it takes a lot more work to track, to trace, to control all these variables, to make the investments. What's your take on that? Do you see that happening in your industries?
Yeah, so I was actually talking with our head of product on the way down here about this question. So in theory, right, sustainability means you do less and you generate more. And so the idea behind potentially less inputs, high yield, less water, potentially high yield, whatever that may look like, you hope that there's potentially some sort of balance on the input side, that your food cost will ultimately cost the same. Now, that's in principle and in theory, right?
Yep.
So in actuality, what does that look like? I think the question will be driven by the consumer. To kind of use Whole Foods and Amazon recent acquisition as an example, Whole Foods did a wonderful job at creating the most perfect grocery store that was an experience, and it wasn't just going grocery shopping. And so one of the things, though, that came out of that with their organic produce was that they weren't necessarily able to scale the whole gamut of classes, if you will, that would go and support their store. And so clearly there is some threshold on willingness to pay. I think the question becomes, as consumers become more socially aware of what is happening with our environment, and that becomes a more stronger compassion, at some level their willingness to pay will increase,
right.
But by how much?
Right, and I think you summed it up great for all the entrepreneurs in the room, that's the challenge that you laid out, and we think it's achievable, right?
Yeah.
We want to produce a sustainable food, but in a way that's not economically going to increase the cost. It actually maybe reduce the cost or improve profits for those growers.
Exactly.
Steve, what do you see as the top, priority or challenge in connecting these consumer demands with the agriculture sustainability? Sometimes they get out of whack, but sometimes they're in alignment. What do you think there?
I'm skeptical that a consumer will pay more. I used to do work in the branding and retail space long ago, and I'm trying to envision how a general interest in sustainability gets translated into a purchase where there's a premium on pricing. So, think about for a moment a product brand. Right, a brand is a very powerful way to express a lot about a product in a very short amount of time, right? It's authenticity, what it stands for, something about the product line. There needs to be, presumably, a third-party sustainability certification of some sort. Well, think about the conversations we've had today. They've been enlightening, but the verbiage of sustainability and what would need to be very simply packaged as a sustainability certification, I think that's not illuminating. Right? So, I was at a lunch today and I had that delicious, I hope you guys had it too, that delicious Frito pie or whatever that was called. It's corn. I didn't say to him, oh, was that, responsibly produced nitrogen responsible corn? No. Right? And so, there are other things which are priorities for a consumer. Convenience, and is it, savory, is it available? So there clearly needs to be a third-party certification. There clearly needs to be a more cogent direction to agree on what that certification actually means. Sustainability is a broad topic, and you can't have 3 or 4 or 5 of these. So I don't think it's impossible. I just don't think we are near it.
Absolutely, and it's just such a complex interpretation of these words: healthy, sustainable. They mean so many different things to so many different people, depending on where they come from
Right.
and what value systems they have. Right. So, how we create that baseline, that fundamental metric, is probably one of the biggest challenges for the industry. Let's change it again to the third leg of the stool here, and that's regulation, right? And generally speaking, regulations look down upon, but we see other countries around the globe taking a much stronger stance on regulation. So, Megan, is regulation a bad thing? Is it a good thing? What do you see any positive role in the role of government and regulation in this society? In this sustainability discussion.
Sticky topic.
It's a sticky topic.
So in terms of, I'll attack kind of the drought situation here in California. I think pretty much everybody in this room would agree with me that the water storage we have access to in California is not sufficient to support the state as a whole. That is run by the government and is something that would be put in place by them. And they are the ones that have the capability to scale that and grow that. So from just a water storage issue that exists in the state, I definitely think that there's ways that the government could definitely play a role in helping us grow that in order to secure our water storage capacity and to support the growing population that we definitely have here in this state. And that's kind of where I will leave my 2 cents on the topic. Keep a little PC.
Very appropriately put. Steve, you want to add to that?
Not really.
Okay.
No, I will say
move on.
I will say this. I would love to see government focus on innovation, fostering innovations, making it easier for the people that are actually in the field to apply their expertise, which are the growers. In the nitrogen space, we interface with regulation with 590 standards and things like that. And it is nearly impossible to write very cogent, broadly applicable policy that makes sense in all of the cases, right? So, for example, if you have, from a sustainability perspective, someone that has been progressive and sustainably producing their crops for many years, and you have a policy that says, well, we want to reward our improvements to sustainability. Well, this grower that's progressive has already, on their own dime, with their own innovation, achieved a level of sustainability that the government wants to reward other people for, and so that's not a good policy either. And in most of agriculture, there's an incredible amount of uncertainty. Of course, you hear about the 40 chances, and if there's uncertainty, what should be rewarded, I think, are best practices. Not necessarily all outcomes. So it's not easy to imagine a well-defined, particularly well-applied set of policies and regulations. But I do like to see the fostering of innovation and that type of investment.
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty consistent as well when you hear about regulation. First off, less regulation, the better. But secondly, if there is, let's make it clear and easy for farmers to comply. Yeah. And we heard a gentleman earlier today talk about how hard it is to even understand what they have to do day in and day out to even comply with a lot of the
and then the
regulation
paperwork affiliated with that also needs to be completed in the field. And so how do you handle that in real
another
time?
challenge for entrepreneurs to solve out there. Just filing the paperwork and the overhead, the bureaucratic overhead that goes with it. So Steve, I'm going to go back to you on this one. Agricultural sustainability, it's such a broad topic. It touches so many things. If you could snap your fingers and make 1 or 2 things change that would really accelerate or advance it, what would it be? What would it look like?
I have to limit it to 2. Well,
2 minutes. 2 minutes maybe. But
that's tough. One of the things I'd love to see is a clear level of traceability from the field to the consumer, and then following the consumer, right? So if you could snap your fingers, we're playing genie here, and you can essentially have a broad scale cost accounting of all the activities and the processes that go from inputs into production and emissions and processing and distribution, And then all of the actual much softer but important investments in, fair labor or, welfare or regenerative agriculture. So you're really capitalizing the cost of those things. That would be a very, that would be a huge accelerant for creating tracing and trackability. There are things that are probably more pragmatic than that. I think in our particular domain, we've been having discussions about creating sort of a sustainability data layer, if you will, and having a ligament that works between these very fragmented set of programs that growers are facing, or they get opportunities to apply into. So, for example, a corn grower, might get some incentive if they put up buffers, right? Or they might have conservation grants, so there might be a carbon trading initiative and so forth. But I'll bring this back to nitrogen. Nitrogen for a corn grower might cost, it might be $80 an acre. And there are other products and services, and the revenue swing of getting it right or wrong is much larger than that. The sustainability payoff from a purely financial perspective is a few dollars. So no rational economic grower is going to prioritize the sustainability programs over the economic imperative of survival, right, of succeeding. Right. However, if you can make a easy way, provide an easy way for them to also apply to these other grants or to multiply apply to see whether they are meeting the criteria for some of these other initiatives, which are very important. I think that would go a long way as well. That would be a starting point for having trackability and simplification of some of the sustainability programs.
So turning over to you, Megan, just to follow up on what Steve's just said there, he talked about carbon credits, he talked about other economic incentives, whether they be regulatory incentives or commercial incentives. What do you think the likelihood of that's happening in the United States in the next 5 or 10 years?
Oh man, in the next 5 to 10 years. 10 maybe, 5 I think that's a stretch and would be quite incredible if that was able to happen in that quickly amount of time. In the next 10 years, I definitely think that's something that you would start to see the potential path on, especially if it was something that we were able to get a decent amount of legislation behind and really encouraging both between the farmer and the grower and reward, right. Which people generally perform when the reward is great and will also offer benefit back to them. But 5 years, no, 10, maybe.
Yeah, it might be a little tough in the current regulatory environment to create those markets.
For sure.
So we'll turn it over for a couple questions here, if anybody wants to ask questions of the panel. We have one.
Matthew Hockin, farmer from New Zealand, Nuffield scholar. So what I sort of took out of it was sustainability is really about kind of the for farmers, because extra for the food. It's really just ensuring that we can continue to farm. That we. Yeah. It doesn't seem to provide a lot of incentive. Do. Are you picking up any of this?
I can hear you a little bit.
A little bit, yeah.
I can't see you. It's like the Spanish Inquisition up here, the lights.
So I start again. So the consumer's not willing to pay for sustainable farming, is what we're kind of saying. So it's really about just establishing the ability of farmers to continue to farm into the future. Is that right? So I'm just trying to think, what are the things that's actually really going to drive some change there, apart from, if it's not consumers paying for it, then it's a regulatory stick.
Yeah. I'll give you one answer. This probably won't be a gratifying one, but we spend a lot of time focusing on soil health, for example. It's critical. There's a great amount of attention and investment going towards it, but we see a structural issue in kind of row crops where predominantly there are absentee landowners, and there are operators, the growers that rent the land. So soil health, and it's been discussed
Oh my God.
Wake you up. I don't wake everybody up.
It'll be soil health is a long-term process, right? I mean, it takes years and years, and it's a slow journey. Meanwhile, you have an operator that's rented the land that has temporarily a very different incentive, right? An annual performance incentive. And this isn't pervasively true, but it is often true. And so in many ways, you have a soil health ambition, but you have a principal agent problem, right? You have the person who cares about the asset economically, and then you have the person who cares about the seasonal performance. And so I think there needs to be a kind of a broader question about the asset and who should pay for it, and what the incentives are for the different actors. It's not always the grower, I think, that needs to be presented with sustainability programs, right? It's the landowner, it's the media. I mean, there's a much broader ecosystem, I think, that needs to be addressed.
To tag on to that, I think for entrepreneurs, it gives us an opportunity to make sure that the tools that we're creating ultimately provide value and cost savings back to the grower that allows them to still meet this level of sustainability in a way that doesn't still translate higher dollar of food cost to the consumer. And I think really when entrepreneurs are coming to this space to create whatever ag tech solution they're coming up with, they need to come with that mindset and considering that in whatever their solution or magic box they're selling.
Well, I think that's all the time we have. I'm sure they can grab us after, but I'd like to thank you guys both for participating.
Thank you.
Thank
for having
you.
us.
This conversation.
Thank you.